Welcome to Pond. My name is Mitch Stein. I'm the co-founder, CEO, and Chief Impact Officer. We want to make tech work for good. So we're highlighting and uplifting the critical parts of the impact technology ecosystem through human conversations with the leaders and shapers of the industry. Let's jump in.
Meet Phil Schermer, a caring strategist that saw firsthand the damage from mental and emotional stress in the political and corporate world. So he decided to launch a nonprofit tech company to tackle the mental health crisis in America.
Well, Phil, thanks so much for joining us. If you wouldn't mind kicking off by just introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your organization.
Sure. I'm Philip Schermer. I'm the founder and CEO of Project Healthy Minds, which is a new mental health nonprofit that's focused on closing the treatment gap in America. 6 in 10 Americans diagnosed with a mental health condition will never get mental health care. We think that's wrong. We think there's an opportunity to use technology to close that gap. And so that's what we're doing.
I mean, it's such an ambitious, innovative concept. There has to be a great story why you started wanting to bring this to bear. Do you mind shedding a little light on that?
Of course. Well, Mitch, like all things, it started over a cup of coffee in New York a couple years ago. I was at breakfast with a good friend of mine, a guy by the name of Harry Remler, who is a well-known music manager. And he told me a story from the music space that became the inspiration for Project Healthy Minds, which was one of the artists that he manages is a hip hop artist by the name of Logic. And Logic released a song in April of 2017. The title of the song is the phone number of the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. That song did phenomenally well commercially. 7 times platinum, nominated for 2 Grammys. But what Harry told me over breakfast was this. The day that song was released, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline saw the second highest call volume in its history behind the death of Robin Williams. A few months later, Logic performs the song at the MTV Video Music Awards. There's a 50% spike in call volume to the hotline. A few months after that, he performs the song as the closing set at the Grammys. There's a 300% spike in call volume to the hotline. And then when we hit the 1-year mark of the song release, the hotline published a report showing the call volume was up 30% year over year since the day the song had been released. So Harry tells me this story, and the way that I hear it, because of my marketing background, is that the song is acting like a marketing tactic to the hotline. And, Mitch, I even before the pandemic, I think we would both agree that you pretty much couldn't go a week without people generally in our age bracket talking about mental health, whether they use the term explicitly or not. People talk about being burned out at work, stressed out. And so it became pretty clear to me that there was something there and that we wanted to go figure out what it was and sort of what we could do to take the core insight around how a song was helping people find help and bring it to scale.
And was there something about, mental health is such a personal thing. And I don't mean to pry, but is there something in your own history, your family, or someone close to you where that struck a chord that made you, I realize why it was interesting conceptually and as a business and as a marketing thing, but personally, why did that speak to you so much?
Yeah, well, of course. Well, look, I think there's multiple layers to it when it comes to mental health for anyone. My whole career, I have always been either the chief of staff to someone senior, or I was the young person to the chief of staff to someone senior, whether it was at BlackRock, whether it was in the Obama White House. And in those sorts of roles, as you know, burnout rate is really high. And you spend enough time in those roles and you realize you eventually hit a wall, and everyone around you eventually hits a wall when you're working around the clock and you're trying to sort of work around the schedule of a senior executive. Inevitably, you run out of juice at some point. So, I had been burned out at various times in my career. Everyone I knew who had been a chief of staff had also gone through the same experience. But if you even take it a layer above sort of just like burnout at work, you couldn't really go a week, whether it was someone in the family or a friend of a friend, where people were not talking about their own mental health journeys. And everybody expresses it in a slightly different way. Some people talk about falling into a depression or dealing with an anxiety disorder or being bipolar. But if you actually listen, there's a lot of other people who describe the exact same thing in just softer language. That they're stressed out, that they can't sleep, that they can't do anything on the weekends because they're burned out, right? But all of it taken together speaks to, I think, what is a generational challenge around mental health.
Yeah, I love the fact that you bring up the language piece. It's actually something we addressed even within my business, where providers of tech solutions want to be able to say, oh, well, I just want to target these words. Like we do CRM, we do peer-to-peer platform. Mm-hmm. And I sort of have to coach folks to be like, you're solving a problem for someone and they don't always have the words to describe it. So I think acknowledging that even if I don't say I have anxiety, but yet I can say the physical symptoms or behavior I'm exhibiting, like that's incredibly perceptive to pick up on that problem.
Well, and for a lot of people, they actually, and this is one of the problems in mental health, they actually don't realize that what they're going through is a mental health challenge, right? They don't have the language and the framework. And so 9 times out of 10, when people actually learn, it becomes freeing because they're like, oh, wait a minute, that has like a name. That's a thing that gives me a mental frame to understand both what's happening and what I can do to move forward.
No, it's about identity in so many ways. Yeah. And speaking of identity and how this concept formed in that coffee shop, a few years ago to this year, the past few months launching and now scaling what you're working on. What do you feel like is the biggest evolution in the vision? Like what has changed the most since the day you said, I'm going to do this to right now?
Yeah. The urgency, definitely. If you look at the statistics pre-pandemic, it is kind of outrageous, right? 65 million Americans diagnosed with a mental health condition. That's 4x the number of people dealing with cancer in America, right? But all of that stuff, 6 in 10 of those people not getting help, all of that is before we spent a year in this social experiment in social isolation, right? And so I think, if you look at what's really changed, it's that we knew that there was a massive desire for people to find mental health services. But what COVID has done is it's broken open the dam that, whatever our timelines were, we have to figure out how to move them forward and how to deliver more value faster. Because when people are stuck at home, they're not seeing their friends, they're not engaged in their normal routines, they're not connected into a larger community, it becomes really dangerous for a lot of people.
There obviously are other folks or other organizations tackling mental health in their own way. What really makes Project Healthy Minds different from those other organizations?
I would say it's a few things, and there's some great people doing great work in this space. But there's a few things that I would say are fundamentally different. The first is we're trying to use technology to make the process of discovering the right mental health service for you easier, right? What we know is that the average amount of time between when someone starts exhibiting a mental health symptom and when they actually get help in America is 11 years. And one of the reasons why it's 11 years is because when you actually try to go find mental health services, whether it's a therapist or a psychiatrist or anything else, it's really confusing. It's really hard. And so for a lot of people, they Google around a bit, they realize it's going to be a pain in the butt, and they say, you know what, I'll figure this out tomorrow. Well, tomorrow becomes next week becomes next month, and next month becomes next year. And so what we realized was if we actually could make the process of finding mental health services more convenient, we could actually shorten that timeline between when people start exhibiting symptoms and when they get help.
I mean, you have amazing statistics and all this stuff, and I'm so glad you have it top of mind. It's really powerful. Is there maybe like a story or a specific experience so far since you launched it, a person who's reached out to you or something that sticks out from someone you've already been able to help that really just keeps you going and inspires you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. There's been an amazing number of stories, but I'll tell you about one person. So shortly after we were on the Today Show, I had someone reach out who's very senior, who works on Wall Street. And we got on the phone, and I had never met this woman before. And she told me the story about how she was at the World Trade Center on 9/11. She developed from that experience PTSD, and a few weeks later, she started having panic attacks, and she had never experienced before. And she had to go through a whole process of figuring out what was going wrong with her and how to manage it. And for a very long time, she basically hadn't told anyone. And she had never gotten involved in mental health nonprofit. And this woman is a very successful female executive now. And when she told her story, I was so moved by sort of the bravery that she clearly had then and now, and the fact that that she was willing to reach out in this moment and say basically, this issue has been close to my heart for a long time, but now I'm ready to actually get into the fight and figure out how I can contribute to, making sure that my kids and my friends' kids and my kids' kids don't grow up in the same kind of environment where people think there's a tension point between dealing with mental health issues and being sort of a high performance person who has career aspirations. You can certainly be both. You can have all kinds of career aspirations, succeed at the highest levels, and still be on your own mental health journey.
I mean, did she say, or do you know what about Project Healthy Minds was the catalyst? I mean, was it the marketing?
Yeah.
Did you ever take credit for it?
No, I asked. I did ask her that. Well, actually, she had an answer that was the same answer I heard from a lot of people, because we had hundreds of people reach out to us after our initial launch, and you heard the same answer come across every time, which was that there's a lot of people in this country for whom mental health has been close to their heart for a long time. Could be for themselves, could be for a kid, could be because of a parent or a sibling, and that's a household that they grew up in, and so it sort of helps shape their whole life. Could be because of a friend. And 9 times out of 10, what people say is, I've always wanted to do something on mental health, but I never found the thing. And when I saw what you were doing and who was involved, and the leaders across industries who were involved, from public policy to healthcare to business, technology to entertainment and media, what everyone basically says, I realized, if those people who are at the heights of their career could be working on this thing together, well, certainly I can too. And so, 9 times out of 10, they don't use the word stigma, but that's actually what they're talking about. What they're really saying is, I've wanted to do something for a long time, but I didn't feel safe doing it. I felt like if I put my name against something, people would think lesser of me. But when I saw that there were people who were really successful in their careers also working on this thing, I finally felt like I could attach my name to something that people wouldn't judge me for, but actually, might support me because I was taking my talents, and applying it to a cause I care about.
As you know, cause dearest to my heart is the fight against AIDS. And you talk about stigma. I mean, that's just nowhere more obvious and prevalent than what people like my uncle faced when he died of AIDS in the 90s. And I just hearing you say that, and me thinking about a friend whose father had a silent battle with mental health and ended up taking his life a few years ago. And it's like, what are we losing from that stigma? It's like kind of overwhelming to even think about. It makes total sense. It's like alleviating the stigma, almost, what you're able to do with the right messaging and the right tech.
Right. And I think, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the LGBTQ fight of the last 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decades, right? Because what you're really talking about in every instance are basically taboo topics that shouldn't be taboo. And what it takes is role models coming out, having the courage to come out and say, I'm gay, or I have AIDS, I have HIV, or I've dealt with a mental health issue, for other people to feel empowered and safe, like they too can share their truth with the world. And the interesting thing is that, you can trace that story back to cancer. I mean, I didn't know this until I began this work, but But 60 years ago, 50 years ago, when our parents grew up, right, cancer was called the big C. And you did not talk about having cancer. And it was really Betty Ford in 1974 who came out about her breast cancer and got a mastectomy at a time when women did not do that. And if you read the reports, contemporaneous reports from the time, what you find is that breast cancer screenings across the country increased 10x after she came out and got her mastectomy. And so the truth is, there's actually a public health playbook that in some ways is quite old, but people just haven't really studied it. And all we're trying to do is take, whether it's from sort of cancer or HIV/AIDS or any other issue, take the playbook and reapply it now to mental health.
That's so powerful. And I know you've been able to gather a lot of great people to your cause, including a team. You're still entirely volunteers? Is that correct? Or you've started?
Yes, we're currently all volunteers, although we are in the process of trying to move some of those volunteers onto full time.
Sure. And so I guess I have two questions about that. One being, like, was it purposeful? Did you have intent around the type of people you wanted to gather around this nexus, picking the right folks and assembling the Avengers squad, if you will? And second is, like, how do you manage, what's the secret to success with volunteers? Because a lot of organizations struggle. A lot of people want to help, and then they aren't able to manage it.
Yeah, no, it's really, really, really hard. So what I would say is a couple fold. One is you have to start by framing the issue and why it matters. I believe that mental health is a defining issue for our generation. Full stop. I think that mental health and climate change will be two of the defining issues when people 50 years later look back and say, every generation takes on certain issues. What were some of the issues that our generation had to take on in ways that their parents and grandparents did not take on? I think climate change and mental health will be two of them. And so for a lot of this work, it actually begins by trying to give it a purpose and articulate a purpose that is worthy of someone's time as a volunteer. For me, in terms of like, what do we look for in a team? I think that the most complex problems demand interdisciplinary solutions, right? That one of the reasons why some of these problems have existed for so long is they weren't problems that could be solved linearly in a linear fashion with just one discipline. It actually, you needed to take healthcare expertise, clinicians, and marry it with Silicon Valley technology expertise if you actually want to build technology products that look as good and are as effective as Uber is, but applied to finding mental health care, right? Or taking marketing discipline and all of the skill sets that we have around how we change the public's attitude about a brand and marrying that with culture makers so that we can change the public's attitude about a health topic, right? And so when we think about sort of like, what do we look for in the team? What we're looking for are like really smart people in whatever their discipline is, who have the capacity to both think outside the box, but to reapply what they know in a particular space to a new category and know how to work. It's a lot of work to figure out how to communicate across disciplines. Doctors do not use the same language as technologists, and they don't use the same language as people who work in finance. And so it's all about finding people who sort of have a discipline, but who have a capacity to work with others to translate it to other applications.
Yeah, and then the common language they do have is the passion, right? For the reason they're all there.
Totally. Yeah, and that's one of the things that's pretty amazing is, it is not, the truth is this work is not for everyone. I mean, you have to have a real passion for this issue to decide that you're going to spend 10, 15 hours a week outside of your job during the global pandemic when everyone's already tired and burned out to work on an issue. But when you find people who have sort of this common thread of passion, it actually binds the team together. but it also brings in other like-minded people because they see that there's other people like them who are talented across industries working together because they all share this sort of common sense of purpose.
I've been honestly really inspired by what you do, and it's made its way into how I even run my business. And I started wanting to post more about mental health personally, as something I care about. And the amazing thing I've found is kind of the more vulnerable I am and the more I push the envelope, the more like people really respond to me and want to reach out and talk to me. And like, it's starting to get to a point where almost every conversation I have, it gets so personal and people kind of unload on me in a way, which is amazing and exciting. But I was just talking to one of my coworkers yesterday, and I was like, it starts to be kind of exhausting, because if you're an empathetic person, you take that on, right? And it's like, I'm really glad I could help you and I want to talk this out and it's great. But like, how do you keep your team fresh and not exhausted? You talk about 100 people reach out to tell you their story about their near death or near suicidal experience. I mean, that's really heavy stuff. Like, how do you all care for each other?
I think by the nature of the people who choose to work on this issue, who choose to volunteer, the work is soul food for them, right? I mean, you're right. It's this weird experience, because it's like you have all these people reach out, and, it's heavy when you hear these stories. And one of the things I've learned in this work is, the reality is there's a lot of people who carry heavy burdens that you never see behind the smile. And it's easy, like intellectually, it's easy to understand that idea. But until you do the work and you actually have the conversation and you realize just how many stories there are, just how painful the stories are, it kind of blows you away, because it's just so at odds with how we interact with each other in polite society, and what it reveals is that there is a certain lack of authenticity and vulnerability in how we operate all together that perhaps isn't the healthiest. That perhaps we could all be more empathetic if we were more authentic, in reality. So in many ways you're right that it is very heavy. But what you come to realize as you reflect on it is that for a lot of these people, even just the act of sharing their story is first, it's an act of courage for them, but also it is therapeutic for them, because what they're really doing is they're trying to channel a individual pain into a shared sense of purpose. And honestly, that's why we do all of this work. We're trying to create some mechanism for people to be able to find a path forward. And so it can be very tiring, but in many respects, it's like soul food.
I feel the same way. It's almost, you just have to remind yourself to like kind of take a moment to take a breath, right? It's like, it can be tempting because it is soul food in a way to charge ahead. I mean, you even talked about yourself, how busy you are doing this in your spare time, but it's so satisfying that it's almost like it's sort of tempting to just do more and more and more, but you won't realize till it's too late that you've you've stretched yourself too far.
Totally. Yeah, no, you're totally right.
And I guess when you think about your own positioning as a tech company, there is this natural friction and kind of dichotomy of like, tech for many of us is a cause of a lot of our anxiety or mental health issues. Growing up with dating apps is like a strange new way you think about your own self and identity and sexuality, and it just really changes things for people. How are you going to turn tech into something that personalizes care or sees people as human and individual? Which don't mean to put that all on your shoulders, but how do you think about that challenge?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. The truth is, tech, like all things in life, is best when not used to the extreme, right? There are lots of things that are good in our life, from lactose to carbs, million of the things. to exercise that, if you take it to the extreme, can be very unhealthy. And I think what you've seen over the last 20 years basically is we've all perhaps taken tech to the extreme in perhaps ways that are not healthy. It doesn't mean that tech in and of itself is not good or has some inherently bad traits, but it means how we use the technology matters, right? And that, like all things, we have to find a sense of balance. And so, I've thought about that a lot. Is it in some ways it's at odds? Is it somewhat at odds to try to use technology to solve a problem that perhaps technology is helping to exacerbate? But if you play all that out, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do fundamentally is figure out where are we right now and how do we get to a slightly more equitable world, and what can we do to move in that direction? And what's very clear is that if technology can help us do that, to me, that justifies the use of it, because I think that what we'll find over the next 20 years is, I think that our relationship to technology will change. And in particular, the social will change, where people will just use it in healthier ways, that maybe like waking up to it the first thing in the morning, going to sleep, and spending 20 hours a day on it is like maybe not the healthiest, and maybe using it to sort of facilitate and empower the real parts of our lives is a slightly better way to use tech.
It's almost, not to get too extreme, but I don't think Mark Zuckerberg's going to be listening to this conversation anytime soon. But you kind of got to use the tools of the oppressor in some ways,
Yeah.
like to get to that audience. It's a little bit subversive, but like you've got to have a big social media presence, even if social media is a massive problem. You're kind of just meeting people where they are in a lot of ways.
Totally. I mean, I don't think that like social media created the mental health crisis. I don't think technology created the mental health crisis. And I think that the reality is these things are deeply embedded in our lives. And if we actually want to help people find mental health care, we have to be willing to use the tools that we got to make progress.
I mean, that's a political strategy, right? Like you can't make change by alienating half the country, right? So
yeah, totally.
You kind of have to figure out it's common ground. And that's the same about tech as much as it is with politics and policy and anything else. Thinking about your organization and you talking about it being a tech business as a nonprofit, I mean, that's pretty rare. What do you, when you talk about it being a tech company, what does that actually mean in terms of how do you use tools? How do you plan around technology? How does it get involved in your strategy as an organization?
It's embedded in everything that we're doing. I mean, what we're basically trying to do is build a technology product that solves a social issue. So we're not trying to monetize it so that we can all, IPO or SPAC this company in 3 years. The idea is, there is a real problem that people have, which is that it is really hard to find mental health services. It should not be this hard, especially in 2021. It should not be this hard. And so I think, when we think about how does it's like everything we're doing is technology based, right? We're trying to build using all the methodology that you would build a digital product. If you were trying to build, Airbnb today, you would do the same thing today, starting with your users, creating mock-ups, testing it, sort of starting from a real understanding of what are the pain points in people's lives and how do we solve it, and thinking about it not as like a single release, like, oh, we're done. We built this website, we built this app, now we move on to the next. It's like there's thousands of iterations. You continually test. You're continually experimenting, iterating, learning, releasing, just in a continuous cycle.
Yeah, I feel like that's the biggest message. I mean, obviously at a tech startup that works with nonprofit organizations. And so I think about this all the time. Like my biggest message to folks is I hear so often, oh yeah, we set our website up already, so we're like good on tech. And the way that the technology sector is developing, there is a tool that's going to make your life better for like any problem you could bring up that is becoming more and more accessible, affordable, usable, and integratable, right?
Yeah, totally.
And so there's just so much to be missing out on. if you don't just have an ear to the ground, so to speak. And by the way, it could help you prioritize the problems you're tackling. If you realize there is a tool, this just happened the other day where someone was like, we're really lucky we've got a developer who's building out this like community platform for our members. And I just couldn't help but ask, but like, have you heard of circle.io or tribe.io? Because they do that out of the box and you could just test it without paying someone to build it. And so the point was, this person thought they had put tech on another part of the organization. But as a CEO or an executive director, I can't emphasize enough that you don't need to be a coder to understand the strategic importance and opportunity with technology.
Yeah, and I think it's even more pronounced for nonprofits because you don't have the same room to maneuver that a for-profit that's raised a bunch of money has, right? You have to figure out how to do more with less. And technology is a real force multiplier in terms of an organization's effectiveness. So I couldn't agree. I mean, as you know, I couldn't agree more with that.
Aside from tech, or maybe something else about tech, I think a lot of nonprofits are legacy organizations, right? They've been around for a long time, and that can be great from a brand perspective and sometimes not so great of legacy systems or structures that are in place. You have the luxury of building something from scratch over the last 2 years. What lessons have you learned from that startup nonprofit experience that you think more impact organizations could benefit from incorporating?
The way I kind of think about the world is that there are certain like truisms that maybe certain industries or sectors or spaces or parts of our life, think that those truisms are clearer than in other places. And so the reality for me is, I think there are certain truisms about how the private sector solves certain problems that are really good and can be reapplied to the nonprofit space. That I can't see any reason why we wouldn't. So just like as an example, I think that there are whole parts of the private sector that are much better at developing audiences and following and rooting the work that they do in a data-driven understanding of the issues and needs and psychographics of the audience that they're supposed to be serving. And there's no real reason why all of the technology, all of the methodology that's used for a direct-to-consumer e-commerce business to do that can't be taken and reapplied to nonprofits so that their advocacy work is force multiplied, right? Because at the end of the day, you think about like grassroots advocacy, getting people to follow you, getting people to use their voice, like a lot of the lessons apply equally. This fundamentally about getting people to care deeply about a topic, right? Could be a social issue, like systemic racism or climate change or mental health, or it could be a brand like Apple that you just love and you talk about and you promote it everywhere and you're an Apple lover. Everything is Apple, right? And so there are truisms on both sides. There are things that I think businesses need to learn, right? Like I think what businesses have to learn from the nonprofit sector is that, especially in today's world, people have higher expectations of all kinds of institutions, right? There's just greater expectations about sort of the ethical level of behavior by individual people, by companies, by governments, by everyone. And so like there are some things that nonprofits do. Fundamentally, they solve issues for people. They make the world a little bit more equitable that I think businesses have to learn from them if they want to maintain their social license to operate in today's world. And I think it equally applies the opposite way, that there's lots of things that nonprofits can take and adopt that actually would make their work. It's not a challenge to their work. It's actually a way to scale their impact.
So what you were just talking about reminded me of a realization I had it's a gradual thing over the past few weeks, but I keep getting reminded more and more that I left a job at Goldman Sachs. I know we bond over like you're at BlackRock in a chief of staff position, and I was chief of staff position at Goldman, both entering the nonprofit space, trying to solve really big problems. And I kind of had a realization that I've learned way more about from working with nonprofits that businesses could do better. So then the other way around. And I'd be curious if you've had one or any experience from your Project Healthy Minds work that has changed the way you do your job at BlackRock.
Yeah, I think community building. And I think that there's like scalable methodologies that businesses use to build audiences and following, but like a real sense of community that like where you know other people in the community. And I think actually nonprofits do a better job of that because they have an embedded advantage, which is that the purpose of the nonprofit corporation is to solve a social issue. And so people are attracted to that. That brings people together. And there's an embedded, obvious shared sense of common purpose in the work that they're doing. Versus for any corporation, you know, this is a whole debate, but a lot of companies are organized around delivering a service to solve a problem that's important, but is not a social, you know, ailment that they're trying to solve. And so for that reason, I actually think nonprofits are much better at building like real interpersonal senses of community. And yet on the for-profit side, you know, if you open up Harvard Business Review right now, you go read 50 articles about the importance of building communities for brands, right? And so it's like some of the like scaled tools of like how do you build audience and following at like an initial level, I think brands can be better at. But how do you create like a real sense of community around a cause? I actually think nonprofits are sometimes much better at that. I don't know that the last time that somebody ever protested in the streets because they worked at JP Morgan. You know, you don't get that kind of reaction most times.
Affinity, yeah. No, it's really true. And I know you've talked about this as a reason you wanted to start this as a nonprofit and not a for-profit enterprise was the sort of easier access to endorsement. And you have a lot of celebrity endorsement that a lot of nonprofit viewers this conversation would be pretty envious of. Maybe give a little advice on what you think was successful in getting that type of endorsement. And obviously, like, yeah, the cause helps, but I mean, tactically, what do you feel like you did well to get that kind of engagement so quickly?
One is I think we've touched on an issue that affects a lot of people, right? So I do think we have an advantage that's not because of anything that we've done or that I've done, which is just like mental health impacts a lot of people. And so there's a lot of people who, when you're asking them to help, they have a reason. You know, the percentage chance that the person you're talking to has a very personal reason why they also care about this issue. It's a lot higher than, you know, for issues that impact a much smaller group of people. So I would just start with like an acknowledgement that there are some things that are outside of our control that have definitely helped us, you know, and that includes people too. The second thing though is about sort of what has worked is it's all about coalition building, right? And people fundamentally want to be part of new ideas that could change the world, that they have a reason to believe will be a winner. That's like just fundamentally how a lot of people function. And so thinking about how you build coalitions and how you get from, you know, who's the earliest mover, the more you get to sort of corporate types, institutional corporate types, they're looking for much more of a track record that signals that you're going to be successful, right? They want 50 things. They want years of track record, right? Then there's other people who really thrive on being like angel investors, angel philanthropists. They thrive off of getting to take risks and being one of the first people to see around the bend, and they want to be part of it. That's like sort of who they are. So some of the work starts with like a recognition about like who's in what camp, because some people are going to be the first movers and some people want to follow the first movers. But if you bring that sort of lens into understanding people to the work, it's a lot easier to figure out, okay, you know what, if I can get these three people, I think that unlocks this fourth person. And once I have those first four, I can then go get the fifth person. And it just builds one on top of the other.
Oh, I think that's great advice, to think more holistically, because I think for so many nonprofits, whether it's celebrity engagement or major donors, there's this like big whale hunting approach that I feel, where they're like, oh no, I'm focused, dead focused on that person, and we've got them through our pipeline and all these steps, and we're cultivating, or no, they're here. But it's almost like you lose the forest through the trees of like, okay, how does that work in concert with the other 5 people that you think can bring
Totally.
recognition to this?
And a lot of people, I mean, I can't underscore this enough. People want to be involved with new ideas that could change the world. And so it's a little bit easier in some ways to get people behind a new idea than to get people behind things that have existed for 50 years, so it's old news. And that's not necessarily right. I mean, you know, there's a lot of people who've been doing great work for a very long time. It's very important. I'm just saying that there's a opening when people start, you know, you have different kinds of challenges because you don't have track record, right? You can't say, well, here's the things that I've done, here are the results. And so for some people, that's gonna close the door for you before you ever have a chance to make the case on the merits. And for some people, it doesn't matter what the merits are. They're not going to look at it at sort of an early stage. But for other people, the idea that they get to participate and contribute to something larger than themselves before it's baked, when it's still in the kitchen and you're still trying to figure out how this thing's going to work. To me, for a lot of people, that's very attractive. And, you know, I think if you think about, for some people, they really think, you know, they're very passionate about like, what is their contribution and legacy in this world? We all have a limited amount of time. And, a lot of people want to have sort of the comfort of knowing that when they get to the end of their time, they've done stuff that matters and that the world was better because they did something. And I think one of the advantages of new ideas is that it's very clear to people, wait a minute, here's something new that matters to me, that if I put my imprint on it, if I help them get to the next level, could succeed and could exist and could help someone like me. You know, it could be the kind of thing that I didn't have when I came through. And I think that's motivating for a whole bunch of people.
I really appreciate all the advice. I would just be curious, do you have a question for me before? I feel like I've just been asking everything of you before we sign off.
No, Mitch, I'd love to know what got you into this work. I mean, you had a fabulously successful career at Goldman. You had every reason to stay focused on your work, but you decided to become an entrepreneur and, you know, build something that you believe deeply in. Why?
I said the other week, I was talking to someone and there are those expressions like, I learned everything I needed to know in life in kindergarten, right? Or I learned everything I needed to know in life in the Navy or whatever. And I was like, for me, I just really believe my version of that statement is, I've learned everything I need to know in life, in my own life. And I try to acknowledge and recognize the value and contributions from every part of my life and everyone that's been in my life. So it's hard to pin it down into any one thing, but there were just sort of a series of things that pointed me towards realizing, don't shy away from being yourself. Which working at Goldman, the support of their LGBT network, for me was a big scary thing about going to take a job on Wall Street. And the fact that it was the exact opposite of I like learned to be out in my whole self at work first was like kind of a crazy concept to me as a kid that grew up in like conservative area in Indiana. So I think there was like a progression of that as I worked there. There was also a progression of validation of me, my abilities, my skills, that just got me to a point where I was like, okay, I'm comfortable being myself. I believe in myself. And I've found an area and a problem that I can't sleep at night over. And I was part of an internal accelerator competition at Goldman, actually, called Accelerate. And they fund entrepreneurs. And I had this idea for like a banking product that could be targeted at nonprofits. I was like, no one focuses on them from a banking perspective. and they're processing billions of dollars in transactions, massive market opportunity, and their tech stacks are horrible. And we got really far in the contest, got to the last round, and pitched the firm my investment committee. And all the way along, I just gotten great feedback. And I was also just obnoxious and called all the senior people I knew to like tell them what I was doing. And so then they were calling me, so they were like, stop having people call us. We get it's like me, I just overkill everything, obviously. But we got to our final pitch and then we didn't get funded. And our advisor of our group took me, and her name is Lucy Walton, and she's a phenomenal person that's still at Goldman. And she took me into a room and told me, and I just broke down, like sobbing, crying. And I had never cried at work ever in my entire career before that point. And we were luckily in a conference room, and I just like couldn't get a hold of myself, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. And I just think right after that, I went on our Cycle for the Cause ride that year. It was like the next day we left to go on the ride from Boston to New York. And just like the entire time I was on that ride and like being in the meeting, I was like, there is something coming out of me that I can't fight anymore. And like them not funding me to stay and do this internally is the best thing that could ever happen. And that was when I was like end of September of 2019. And I was like, first week of March, 2020, I'm going to leave, not knowing the next week is the pandemic. But no, I mean, it's always a succession and progression of things. But if there was a moment where it hit me, that was definitely it.
Well, I'm thrilled that you're in this fight and building this.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being so generous with your time and sharing. And yeah, I just know people love the organization, but obviously we both know that they really appreciate the cause and the focus on the cause. So I appreciate you sharing and shedding so much light on it today.
Of course. Well, thank you for including me. Always a pleasure, my friend.
Thanks for coming by. Be sure to visit joinpond.com and jump in when you're ready.